Okay, today we are looking at women in the 1920s and kind of the changes in society and what was going on during that time. So, in order to understand how kind of like the flappers came to be, and the structure of the 1920s with Hollywood and movies and kind of all that stuff, kind of have to look at how that developed, and that really goes with this connection to post war prosperity that happened because of World War One, right? So coming out of World War One, the U.S. was considered a lender nation. And the reason for that had to do with, in part, the structure of in two parts, really. The first was that we had, when we were neutral, or trying to be independent, if you will, from the rest of the war and the groups, because we wanted to maintain our economic structure with anyone. So you say, well, we're a neutral party, so we can keep, buying and selling things from whoever, because we're not supporting any one side in the war, even though that wasn't, entirely true because of alliances and just really closer alliances with some than others. But so we did have lending to allies. And some of that was expected loss. Other of that, though, was an expectation that the money would be paid back. So you end up sometimes with interest, sometimes not. But you have this money that then you're making after the war. And you could even say, well, we won't put with interest the whole time, because we'll just say money back. Sometimes it was interest, sometimes it was not. But this idea that that we made money off of warfare is really true. The other was to Germany, and this took place after the war. So one of the things that happened after, at the end of the war, was the Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty was very punitive to Germany, and really is one of the reasons that, it's not the only reason, but it's going to set the conditions for Germany to move towards accepting Hitler over time. And one of the things that it had in the Versailles Treaty, one was a guilt clause, which was not related to money, but the idea that Germany had to claim guilt for the war, even though they technically weren't the ones that started it in World War One. The other thing that they had to do that was a big one was reparations. They were expected to pay for all costs of war, which, by the way, is impossible to do. So what we did is that the U.S., what they did is that they gave money to Germany after the war, and to essentially prop it up somewhat. And then that money, a lot of that money that was given to Germany, that money went to European countries, because they had to pay for all the cost of war. And this was definitely seen as a mistake as time went on, and the Treaty for World War II reflected that recognition of massive punitive reparations don't work and only create bad conditions. So you have this cycle of giving money to Germany, Germany gives that money to to European countries that they have to pay the reparations back to, and the Western countries give us money back from the various things that we lended to them, and then you reinvest that back into Germany's. But all of this does have interest in it. It's not just cycling the same amount of money. And so, what it created though was this cycle of wealth that ultimately led to, we'll put it as 3. So this cycle of wealth, or we'll say a cycle of lending, right, led to prosperity and increased wealth in the U.S. And this is what the 1920s is going to end up then economically coming into, is a very sound economic position. And then to top that off, you have a second part besides just being a lender nation, was the increase in production from the war industry, and we'll just say industry in general, which not only created a larger corporations, but here we'll put that down too for that. So increased not only corporations and the numbers of corporations and the overall wealth of these larger corporations, as well as essentially a national consumer. Consumption, consumerism increased significantly because with the increase in production and industry, you have more jobs, more products. So more jobs, more products, and this leads to more buying. And all of this then is going to set the stage for not only a national market, by the way. So think about like the toothpaste you buy, or deodorant, or thousands of other products. A lot of these brands are nationwide. Like we expect, or even if we don't consciously think about it, we expect that if I go and I buy something here in California and then I travel to New York, that I can find those exact same brands. And in fact, it also created somewhat later a worldwide market. While not as universal, I still can go to England or France or Germany and find some of the same brands and products. It's not as extensive, but that is eventually what it becomes, is a much larger worldwide. And it's certainly the goal of corporations, is if you have a worldwide market, your wealth, your what is it, your gross income, not income because that would be for a paycheck, but your gross product, domestic product wealth, or worldwide product wealth would be significantly larger. But this is the start of a national market. So food, appliances, brands, cosmetics, things like that. You for the most part, it doesn't mean there were still local markets, and there still are today. You think about like the Piggly Wiggly. We don't have that in California. But then, so you do have regional products or regional stores or brands or things like that. But there's so much a nationwide brand that you kind of expect. If I buy like Crest or Colgate toothpaste, I can get that anywhere in the U.S. because that product is there. And that actually developed after World War I and during the 1920s. How this is connected to women has to do with the fact that the flappers are going to develop because of this increased wealth. They're going to have that kind of a luxury and ability to of consumption and consumerism because of this increase in wealth. There's other factors we're going to look at too, but that plays a role in it. Hollywood and the movie star and the extravagance of that stuff develops because of this increase in wealth. An increase in work is going to develop from that. as well. So and all of that's going to play a role into what, like, the jobs that women are going to be able to do. Yes, it was because of their World War I war industry labor, but also because there were more jobs available. We'll see with the Great Depression, as soon as jobs get tight, women are the first ones to look to say women shouldn't be working. When the economy is good, more opportunities open up for women. But we'll definitely see, like I said, women, and then obviously with the Great Depression, Black women were some of the first to get cut, and other minorities that were women were definitely the first on the chopping block, and then white women second to that. But when you have an excess of jobs available because of a high, strong economy that encourages consumption and consumerism, then you have a lot more options and availability for what can happen. The next thing with that develops post-war, that we'll keep with post-war. It could be a separate thing too, but we're not going to get too much into it, is the auto age, if you will. And this will play a role in a lot of things as well. So the U.S. was a major car manufacturer and in the world at the time. So the U.S. was a major car manufacturer. That the numbers now is not the same as it was back then. Far more places now make cars. Japan makes a lot. Germany makes some. The U.S. still has a strong market in it, but at the time, around the 1920s, 85% were made in the U.S. So you had a very strong car industry that also benefited from this increase in economic prosperity that took place. Henry Ford is the most famous, in part because he standardized the factory line. So that, I mean, and not just standardized, but really made it super efficient. And yeah, there was factory labor before this, but the whole idea of like piece parts, so like one part, one person in a line makes this part, and then it moves down the line and they add another part, and then it moves down the line and they added another part. That is what he did. He standardized and made it super efficient. So why this was important is that it allowed him and his company to produce not only a lot of cars quickly, but efficiently, which means that then he could charge less for the cars than some other competitors, which made Ford more popular, with the Model T being the car to have for quite a long time. The other thing that he did is that he gave a $5 wage. This was huge at the time. So paying his workers really well. And this wasn't selfless by any means. It was, so the idea was as though that workers could buy one of his cars. His philosophy was that if they work for that it was ridiculous to have workers building the Model T, right, and yet not being able to afford to buy it. And so that propelled that idea. The Model T around this time was $300, and a large part of the population had cars. What's significant about cars, right? What is, why is this important? Well, there is a massive change in society with the development of cars. So you have, if you think about it in terms of just what it, other industries or jobs that it creates. So here we'll put industry and jobs, right? You get, let's see, building of roads, gas stations, billboards, which is going to be with advertising, which is coming into its own with the 1920s because of the CPI. You also have motels, people going on road trips, things like that, repair shops. Well, and there's an increase for paint and rubber, and so on, right? Then you also have activities and work life. Well, activity will go under life, let's say. So for that, you have the suburbs. The 1950s and the suburban housewife happens because of the transition to suburbs. Suburbs started off with the you have Levittown, which were like kind of manufactured homes, which were could be shipped in the pre-cut pieces and then very quickly put together. This the cities and suburbs they were starting a little bit before this time period, but the problem before the car was that it wasn't super accessible. Because if your job was not in the suburbs or where you're in walking or horse riding distance in that sense to your location, it was not realistic. The car now can traverse a lot further area in a quicker amount of time, which means people can not live in the city but can live in the suburb but still work in the city and have it be reasonable, right? So this also is going to influence job availability in the sense of, you know, where you can work. People could work further away than before. General movement of, you know, people living further away. Up to this point, you know, before cars, people tended to, on average, live no more than 10 miles from where they were born. And of course, that doesn't include everyone. I mean, obviously, we had westward migration, the Oregon Trail, and people willing to set out and go move really far away. But on average, most people tended to stay close to home because it not only meant leaving family, but potentially not seeing family again. You know, if you moved out west and you still had family on the East Coast, until the railroads were really an easy passenger option, people weren't gonna come visit. The railroads were the first with industrialization of allowing for more mass transit and having people visit in certain areas and having it being reasonable. Cars make it even easier with that. The other thing that it influences actually dating. You have before this that women that you courted. So you didn't go on dates. If someone was interested in you as a woman, they would approach your parents and talk about their intentions, and then you would court with adult supervision with the potential of getting married. Cars create this opportunity to go on dates, to actually, without adult supervision, is going to be the kind of changing trajectory with that. But where you can go do activities, which that's another thing, social activities. Drive-in movies, and then travel and entertainment, right? These things all develop because of the car, and these especially become very popular with flappers and really allow the flappers to kind of develop the way that they did. If you looked at the videos, and we're going to look at a couple too, one of the things that's connected with that is how much it's activity driven, consumption based and activity driven. There's the videos that are on Canvas show the flappers, like always they're doing things, they're going out and doing things. And while some of that, yes, you could go walk to, a lot of it was connected to driving. In fact, they actually made a car for women, and we'll see in the advertisements that they're advertising a woman driving, talking to another woman, because women were large consumers of the car and excited about the car because it provided a sense of freedom to be able to go out and do things. And we'll see also how that becomes limiting in the 1950s with the suburban housewife, when a family only has one car and the husband takes it into work, and the women end up stuck within the home and the small surrounding area that they can walk to or take public transportation because they don't have access to the car. So it can either be something that's incredibly freeing, or without it, something that's very limiting for women, especially because they were the ones who were more likely not to have a car than have a car. And yet during the 1920s, a lot of women had access to cars, or like the driver's license I showed you from the 1920s that was in New York for a woman, that they went out and they got their driver's licenses once those became a thing. As more and more cars came, they had to put regulations into it. But just to give you an idea of, like, for example, people living in cities more than rural areas were increasing. And then, like Houston was in 1910 had around 75,000 people. By the 1920s, it had 300,000 people. So you have an increase. It's not just the suburbs. It was an increase in cities, but also the early development of suburbs. And that happens because of the ability to drive and move around. The next thing that we're going to look at is with flappers and mass culture. So you have the new mass culture. And within this, one of the first things that develops, and then we'll look at the flappers second, was movies. Movies became a huge thing and ended up influencing people quite a bit. I mean, the whole idea of Hollywood emerged, and celebrity emerged during this time. The earliest kind of films you had were silent films that were often called Nickelodeons because they cost, the Nickelodeons technically came first, but they were also silent films. So silent films eventually expanded beyond Nickelodeons, but they go together. So Nickelodeons were 5 cents, right? Nickelodeons, right? And the Nickelodeons were often 15 minutes to an hour, but silent films too. You usually didn't go over an hour. There were a few that did, but that was kind of the range, and they became extremely popular. What's really interesting is with silent films and Nickelodeons, the director was more important than the actor, because it was seen as the director. So the directors were the kind of famous ones initially. You'd go visit a film or go watch a film because whoever the actor was in that, the director was in that. And the actors were kind of interchangeable. There definitely were some that were very famous. There were one of the silent films. I'll put a link to it so you can see it. Was called The Flapper, and it had a famous actress who. There were a few actors or actresses that did kind of step beyond just the director. This was a kind of about, it was the first film actually addressing the idea of a flapper and what that was. But again, most of the time the director was more famous. Then what you had is a shift to, movies with sound, with 1927 Jazz Singer. What's crazy with this is it was so popular that there were films that had begun working with silent film, and once they saw the Jazz Singer, they scrapped the whole thing because they realized no one was going to go see silent films anymore. The thing that's important about the Jazz Singer, besides being the first film with sound and speaking, actors speaking, was that it shifted the focus to actors and actresses, right? So now the men and women became the center, and this sense of celebrity became incredibly focused on these, well, both sports stars, which wasn't really a thing before, and celebrities. And women were amongst the most focused on. The women actors were the most sought after, the most photographed, the most emulated. You end up getting this kind of fantasy and attachment to movie stars. People wanted to know what they're like, how did they live, what did they wear, what was their haircut. And so you had magazines that weren't quite tabloids or anything yet, but magazines and goods that were all focused on the women's hairstyles, right? That get like your hair like this actress, what clothing they wore, the men that they were dating, and all of this. I mean, this sense of celebrity, is still here today. That hasn't changed, but it started because of the shift in film, and again, really centered on women and the actresses, and like, say you'd have this is this actress's hairstyle, get your hair cut like this. They actually did there was this I don't know, psychology experiment, I guess, if you will, where they wanted to look at, in the 1920s, what the impact of celebrity on women's celebrities was on young girls. And so they gave these young girls diaries and just said, write about your day and what you think. And so remember, I did mention, right, that a lot of diaries from this time period and really in the past often were just kind of like you wrote your to-do list. It wasn't written in a to-do list format, but it'd say what the weather was. It would say what they did for that day. Well, they encouraged young girls to write more than that. Like, not only what did you do, but what were you thinking? What were you feeling? And a ton of the girls, what they wrote was talking about, if not obsessing about actresses and and how they wanted to emulate their hair, or what clothes they were wearing, or what they noticed about that. This was coupled by advertising that used celebrities, and so you get it reinforced not only in watching the movies, but advertising that got used famous people to promote their products, and then the magazines and the stories, right? That so that it became kind of everywhere within society. But what I said was interesting with this is just how much this had on a massive impact on young girls looking to replicate where they could these famous actresses' lives. Just more so than boys. Definitely like this. They did one with asking the boys, and there was some with sports. It still was developing more, but you do see that sports kind of became the thing for young boys, and actresses for young girls. But just like I said, the whole idea that what they wrote in their journals was this idea of how they watched movies, read magazines, and the advertisements that they saw all influenced them and had a very strong focus on actresses and emulating that. But one of course, the positive for this small select group of women who were famous actresses is that they made a lot of money. The downside was that you definitely had a whole new thing that celebrities deal with now today, which is seen as more common and expected. But this wasn't a known thing at the time. That your whole life was going to be cataloged through photography, through film, through magazines, and that people were going to have a certain expectation of displaying wealth and leisure. And it really was connected to that because of the economy, because of the increase in wealth and leisure. Then these actresses were expected to showcase that. And then, of course, within the film industry, we could put that here too. From almost the very beginning, women had to deal with sexual advances, we'll say. There are stories from actresses, some that were more well known, others that were smaller actresses, that there was almost an expectation they would have sex with the director. And if you didn't, it would be harder to get a role. Not only that, but they were sometimes required to be in relationships with other famous actors. Either sometimes for like real relationships with famous actors, sometimes where it was fake, but they had to pretend for when they were in public in certain events to hype up the movie. So all the stuff that kind of came out with like Weinstein and the issues that women have to deal with in Hollywood almost started from the very beginning. Only it was open and expected, and eventually became, I mean, they even said Weinstein was like an open secret in the industry. But it definitely, it was very, very open in the 1920s about it. And no one cared, if anyone said anything, kind of thing. If you wanted to work, unless you were already a famous actress and could command kind of control of that, there was going to be this kind of expectation of that. And not only that, and I'm going to put this under here, but it's kind of separate. Complete control over looks. So there were stories of actresses that talked about later how, they were not only told to lose weight, but fix their teeth, change their hair, get etc., etc. Like I forget what I was watching, but it was talking about this actress, and she was an older woman at the time, but she was talking about how that she was an actress in the 30s, and when she went in, they basically said, like, you need to change everything about you. You're great, but here's how you have to do. And it was like put into their contract. And while some of that also still goes on, again, it's just this kind of excessive emphasis on not only how the actresses looked, but kind of complete control of their bodies in every single way. So that, still, if you have Hollywood being developed because of that, or not because of that, but when it was developing, this was like ingrained into it. It's not surprising that it was still so pervasive to this day, because it was connected to that aspect of it. You also are going to have, impact on young people, not only with the clothing and the hair and behaviors, but the sexual scenes as well. And those are, like I said, all talked about, and I think you see replicated in the advertising with the whole idea that kind of sex sells was a new thing for sure. And especially that women could be sexual was a new thing as well. And in that sense, right, that was something that was unique with celebrities, was this idea that women had power and sexual power and were in control of that. That you also, this is where you get the femme fatale. So it was not just that they had control of sexual power, but sexual power that could be deadly in that process as well. Sports also became professional sports stars really became a thing during this period, and that the whole celebrity status. So Babe Ruth is probably the best example of this, but this is actually where then you start developing high school teams as a recruiting ground for professional sports, and then the advertising for that. Let's look at advertising, then we'll look at the flapper. One of the things that we'll see is that a lot of it let's do the flapper first, because advertising is going to target kind of the who the flapper was. So of course, one of the things with the 1920s was the flapper, which was a term for women that dressed a certain way and acted a certain way. So there are a couple of things with this. There's three kind of main. I'll put the three main categories, and then we'll talk about that. So one was we'll say a defiance of traditional gender roles, and this then is connected to what you see the flappers doing and what they did. The dresses that they wore were short, and somewhat seen as scandalous, in the fact that like no more long sleeves, shorter skirts. The skirts had started to rise up before the 1920s a little bit. But now you had above the knee, loose, not structured. A lot of the like progressive era clothing was very structured pieces, either the dress or separate pieces. And really actually through most of the US, if you look at like the clothing that women wore, it was very structured and defined, so that the clothes actually kind of shaped you rather than the other way around. Now you had very loose flowing dresses, and we'll look at some pictures with that. But then, of course, the short haircut, which was seen before the flapper as a man's haircut. I mean, just think about the fact that, like, women cut their hair to go disguise themselves as men, and all it took to disguise yourself as a man during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War was to wear pants and cut your hair. And that because it was so hard for anyone to fathom that women were wearing or having short hair and wearing pants. While the flapper dress is the most famous connection, wearing pants became a thing, in part because of the flapper, in part just in the 1920s, that women didn't wear pants before, now did. It was also about smoking in public, which is not to say that women weren't smoking before, but women did not smoke in public prior to this. Drinking in public, even with the prohibition, going to speakeasies, drinking in public, that was a big thing. Playing sports, baseball and other things. Just also being outspoken, going out without, without any type. I mean, that already started without any type of adult supervision, or some of these. There were young adults, 16 to 16 to 28ish. But the idea that you had to have a male chaperone, right? That wasn't there. That was already leaving during the progressive era. But again, just that what the flapper did defied traditional gender roles. I skipped the word with gender here, so let me put that in. Okay, the next aspect of the flapper was this kind of, they were an economic symbol. With consumption, consumerism.
Consumerism
nope.
is a social.
No, thank you, Siri. What part of that brings in the assistant? I won't say her name again for that. I feel like the computers are always listening to me, apparently. So an economic symbol, the idea of consumerism, and so there is a lot of this, the flapper being defined by the goods and activity, the goods she was able to purchase. Right, this would include the dress, jewelry, makeup, but also activity based. So we're going to look at a clip in a video in a minute, right? They're always doing something. I mean, I suppose it'd be a boring video that they didn't record that, but it's what the flapper was defined by, right? Whether that's going out drinking and dancing, right? So you're going to a club and going out dancing, going to a party, going to the beach. It's that you're going to an activity that costs money. That not just that, but like the whole clothing, the whole ensemble plus the activity, all of which that, I mean, you see too, this sense of leisure to have the money to be able to participate in leisure activities. So this was definitely a middle class thing, largely defined in society by white middle class women. Now, black women also partook in the flapper movement, and there is argument for that it actually originated within black culture with the rising middle class that was taking place within black communities, and women in starting to express themselves with modern consumption in a way that they had not been able to before. And you do see one of the last video that I posted, there's 3 in Canvas. The last one has a lot of good pictures of black women that were dressed as flappers and were floppers, and what they did and showcased that well. So it required middle class status, at least, though. And while it was more defined by white women, and certainly in advertising that it was emphasized largely towards white women, there was one in your book that shows advertising to black women with the flapper kind of style. So they definitely were a part of it, but definitely less than white women, and certainly expressed less in advertising and in the videos in society. But in anyone who was in middle class access, because again, you had to have enough money or have your parents have enough money that you could participate in not only the consumption and purchase of all this stuff that you needed to be a flapper, essentially, but to participate in the leisure activities that was what defined a flapper. And it's why advertising ends up so much focusing on the styles and aspects of the flapper, because they're the ones they were the ones purchasing. it was also idealized in many ways, as this kind of idealized sense, but and at the same time was super beneficial to women because it showcased positively women define traditional gender roles, and it wasn't looked on negatively. It was embraced by society and advertisement and people. I mean, there were still critics, yes. There was a conservative movement within the 1920s that criticized some of this. But by and large, the flapper movement wasn't seen as some subversive movement, but instead was embraced by society. And that was allowed women to express themselves, to participate in activities that they had never been able to do before, at least not without significant criticism. And so that's such a huge kind of deal with that. Now, the third one has to do with the youth and we'll say sexuality. So while there were women who dressed in the flapper style and that were married, what was showcased was usually, younger girls and women, usually from, again, like 16 to 28 years of age. But this, again, that didn't mean that there weren't married women who were flappers too. But what got defined as it in society was this kind of age range. Again, mostly defined as white, middle class, and college educated. So some, it was, girls who were going to college, and that also provides some of that freedom. But definitely from, like I said, the families that had the wealth to be able to do this was part of that. But that kind of symbol of being a younger, active girl or woman who enjoyed life, which was definitely part of that leisure activity component to it. But then you have this sexuality component to it. So both just in the idea of their interactions with men, the dancing, the going and hanging out with men without supervision, dating was a huge aspect of the flapper, going on dates, and that's that connection to that is seen as being sexualized. But you also see it in advertisements, this shift to basically this idea of sex sells, right? And that you can make women alluring as a flapper to sell stuff. This also gets connected to makeup, interestingly enough. Makeup had been, women wore makeup. It wasn't like they didn't wear makeup, but they did not advertise for it before the 1920s. Significantly. I mean, it was in like catalogs and mail order stuff, but you didn't put it out there a lot. And we'll see in the advertisements, right, that it's going to get connected to kind of sexual poses or women enticing. One's called Kiss Proof, and it's the idea of like that they're going to be kissing, that they're going to be having sex and stuff like that. And the reason that they didn't advertise a lot before the 1920s is it was connected to prostitutes. So even though women wore makeup, the idea of lipstick and heavy makeup was very much associated to prostitution. But that negative connotation of prostitution got removed, but the sexualization of makeup did not. And so you see, like I said, these kind of defining characteristics, and then it's reinforced in movies and with famous actresses and the magazines and the advertisement. So let's look at a clip from one of the videos, just pay attention to what is being shown. Not only how the women look, but what are they doing, right? In this clip of the various it's various film shot of flappers during this time. So think about these categories: defiance of traditional gender roles, consumption, and youth and sexuality, and how are those things showcased in this video. So here we go, and the music right for it is just fun music. It doesn't have any relevance outside of that. Some of it is connected to the style of the 1920s. Okay, so, oops, there you pause that. Come on, there we go. Right, this aspect of, right, even at the very end, that final aspect that they're flying to the beach, it is definitely that idea of consumption and wealth. But right, lots of dancing. Dancing, I mean, was definitely kind of the key definition besides the hair and the dress. If you're like top three things is that. But like, so we saw the things that they're, playing sports, playing baseball, smoking in public, dancing, lots and lots of dancing, but it's all like leisure activities, being at the beach, enjoying time at the beach, going to the fair, right, is what it looked like with the swings and the other attraction that way. Having fun, laughing, all that kind of aspect of emphasis on the clothing, where they're showcasing and showing off the different types of clothing, which was definitely doesn't look, it looks expensive in parts, not all of them, but a lot of them they do, and that was the intent of showcasing off your clothing. There was a big emphasis on having a lot of different clothing. Cutting the hair, right, that because women were cutting their hair short like that, they actually had to go to barbers and initially have like what was considered a man's cut, and it showed them there with a barber doing with a straight edge. And then the example, right, where it shows the Victorian women in their dress, I love that clip because it's like a great showcase of just seeing the contrast in styles of clothing from the Victorian style of dress that was around in the Progressive era, and how different the 1920s was. Even women who weren't considered flappers, still their dress was significantly different than what it had been in the Progressive era. But it's a great kind of showcase of them looking at and analyzing these young girls' clothing. And how short. There's a different clip that wasn't in this video that shows like a policeman that was measuring, because there were still rules like at the beach of like how long your swimsuit had to be, like on the bottom, and whether it had sleeves or didn't in some areas. And so there was a clip where it shows them like measuring that, or the fashion show where she was walking, because there was a huge emphasis on clothing and purchasing clothing. But like I said, everything they did in that was like, fun activities, and doing something, and most of those things would have cost money in the process. But there's definitely is an emphasis on having fun. The flapper was a symbol of a good time, enjoying life. Right, that's and it definitely was connected to the idea of leisure and consumption. That leisure and consumption allowed for you to enjoy life and have a good time. But all of those things they were doing was so, like I said, what's important with it, I think, as far as with women, was the fact that for the first time, all of these challenges to traditional gender roles were looked on positively and seen as acceptable, and it opened up and allowed women to do a lot more than they had done in the past. Now, there's still another connection to this in the idea of that women eventually, the idea was the flapper was a kind of a temporary thing, which is why there wasn't an emphasis on married women as such. It did have long-term consequences in the sense of that women could do certain things and activities in society that they may have done but not in public before, but now we're okay to do publicly. But there still was this expectation that after you got to a certain age, you'd get married. And once you got married, you then weren't going out and doing quite as extensive amount of leisure and entertainment, because you would be settling down and have a family. And there still definitely was a traditional expectation in the 1920s that once you got married, you would have kids and you would raise those kids. And so I think that's why it's youth, right, and sexuality, because there was this was acceptable for younger women to do, but then you were going to fall into more traditional roles, not quite as extreme maybe as in the past as far as what those limitations were on women, but that you still would fall into those more traditional roles and expectations. Oh, where did my notes go? There they went. See, computer just still randomly doing what it wants to do. Okay, now we're going to look at advertising. So we're on C. Okay, and just all right, with advertising, it changed and developed because of the CPI and World War One, specifically with a change in using full, well, not full, but color, larger pictures, and less words. And then the last thing that they really learned from it was this idea of really the psychology of advertisement, that right, you, instead of just showcasing what you have, you put an emphasis on desire, or transforming a want into a need. With advertising in the 1920s, then you have say themes with that were a large number of the advertisements were of women. Women were the focal point. They were for women, and that was definitely a significantly new component to advertising. And it makes sense in terms of the aspect that there was a lot of connection to the flapper, and with what we're looking at with the style of clothing. You have advertisements for makeup. There tends to be an emphasis on enjoying life. You also have which would go with women too, but this advertising sexuality, which was definitely not something that was done before. That was very taboo, and now that became a huge focus of advertising and acceptable. And then just also showcasing other activities. We'll just put activities that were connected to the flapper. But it definitely had most of them connected to that idea. Let's look at some of these here. So you have this one here for perfume. So you notice that, right, you, in some of these, there's so few words that you're not even sure at first what it's advertising. I mean, here we have the picture of what it is, but the emphasis is on the woman, and it's the flapper style, right, of clothing, the hair, but you also have an emphasis on luxury and leisure and wealth. And so it's meant to be alluring, it's meant to be enticing, that you too can look like this with this perfume. Here's one with sports that I put in just to showcase the sports. And also I liked the saying, this is something that probably wouldn't go over well today, with make kids husky. Most people, that's not what they want to do, but it's for, you know, oats. Here you have Nuevo Mundo, New World, and it's just showing a woman lighting a cigarette, and again in this kind of dressed up, fancy way. Here you have, right, advertising clothing styles, specifically with the flapper dresses. This one is for Chevrolet, but what I think is fascinating about this is, right, that you have it's advertising for a car, but again the driver is a woman and she's talking to her friend. Instead of having a man as the driver, right, they're advertising this to women, and having the expected part of it that women are driving. Um, that's a big step in not only women as consumers, but that they're the ones actively participating in all of these kind of new technology and new things. Here's one for makeup. So Rogue and the different shades, but then again, I mean, obviously the makeup is for women, but then showcases that kind of flapper style. Here, this is for stockings, right? And all it says is Berkshire stockings. And then it has this kind of woman with her knee raised, maybe dancing or just in this kind of pose. Lots of color. This one is for this alcohol. Same thing, right? That idea of having fun and drinking. This right, the showing women drinking was definitely a new thing, because women drinking in public was taboo. In fact, they one of the ways that women drank alcohol was in these kind of elixirs that were like vitamin elixirs, but were like with a lot of alcohol content. And so women would take teaspoons fulls, or not teaspoon, tablespoons full, like 2-3 times or more a day. And actually, if they did quite a bit in a short amount of time, could get very drunk off of it. And there was definitely this saying of like, oh, mother's just taking her vitamins, which was code for being drunk, because that was the acceptable way. You didn't advertise it. You certainly didn't glorify it. And here you have it as looking at as this exciting, entertaining thing, again with women drinking, not men. There was another one with sports, right? And also, of course, showing cigarettes. No, it's toasted, no throat irritation, no cough. Hosiery for the misses. Also, the fact that they're using, photographs a lot of the time. This one wasn't. That one, this one's a drawing, but a lot of them were using photographs as a starting point, and then having drawings as part of it, where they would take photographs and then they would convert it into a drawing. Kiss proof, right? So here, right, there's the sexual component, the idea of that makeup, gives you this kind of sexuality, and that the kiss proof, the expectation that women are kissing, that was stuff that would have been taboo before as well. Here we have, right, this Hollywood stars, or we'll say celebrities. The aspect of the use of celebrity, but is how famous movie stars keep their hair beautiful. So talking about the hairstyles, so then young girls could emulate. Now this is an interesting one. If only I could tell this to every business girl. So one, you have women as office managers, which talks about the increase in work that was available to women at this time. But this is for Kotex pads for your period. And just not that long ago, it was completely taboo to talk about a woman's period at all. In fact, like I said, mothers didn't even often tell their daughters anything. And now you have advertisements for it. That is a huge step in having it become acceptable to talk about these things, to advertise these things for women. And it showcases when you have an emphasis on women in these different ways, that then this becomes more acceptable as well, right? Versus when it's always about men. Then this is a great one for enjoying life, right? Get a kick out of life, right? You want to get a Harley Davidson because it's fun. Look at how much fun they're having. But it also reinforces, right, that leisure component as well. So what's significant, and then here's another one for a variety of, this one has a lot more writing, which is significant too, and most of them didn't at this point, but it is color, and it's advertising a variety of products, beauty products. Okay, so the idea with the advertisements and stuff was that, and the main themes were women and flappers, and the idea that with women, both advertising with women and to women, right? It wasn't just using women. We're going to see in the 1950s how while there are some ads that are advertising to women, that they use women to advertise to men. But here you have a ton of emphasis on women and doing all these activities, and intentionally not only using women, but because they were two women, because women were a significant purchasing power because of not only more women than ever working, but spending with the economy and that flapper kind of ideology that took place. Consumption and consumerism with women was at an all-time high. But I also think it shows like just the changing viewpoint of women, that's where the focus went to. But hopefully you also saw the CPI influence with those changes to full color, and less wording, with an emphasis on trying to create kind of an emotional connection to the product they're selling. And the sexuality component that was definitely a big part of it that was very taboo before, which was now largely acceptable in many ways. Okay, what we're going to look at next is, so go to 3, women in politics, right? In the 1920s, you have the 19th Amendment that is created, that allows women the right to vote. And this is going to showcase the some of the politics that emerged from this. And the 19th Amendment, I should say, right, came about because of all of the suffrage movement of women during the Progressive Era. Women's right to vote. Oops. And so, like I said, what we have looked up to this point really led to, and through World War I, the women finally getting the right to vote federally. Of course, in practical application, that's not going to apply to Black women in the South. They're still, just like Black men, going to be denied, for the most part, the right to vote because of the segregation. And we looked at, like I said, the literacy test and poll tax that were in place to limit Black voters specifically. That does become an issue because as women celebrated finally the 19th Amendment passing and getting the right to vote, Black women said, well, hey, yes, but no, like, yeah, the amendment passed, but we're still not able to vote. And some looked and wanted to continue pushing for that, and others who were, significant figures in the women's movement and the right to vote kind of went, and called it good. And so this eventually will have women forming their own group to continue the fight in the South to make it more equal for women, and not only Black women, but men as well, being able to vote in the South, because that still was routinely being denied. So you may have in the 19th Amendment the federal law that states it, yet there still was discrimination in which women could vote in certain areas, but especially, like I said, in the South, with segregation that had set up all these rules and regulations. Most of the places in the North didn't have literacy tests. And so the big deterrent that still existed were poll taxes, which did occur in the North, and definitely did limit poor voters from voting if they couldn't afford the poll tax. And that will eventually be overturned as well, because you will have changing kind of definitions of the right to vote versus the privilege to vote, which had been established with Minor v. Happersett. With this shift, there was the first thing that happens is that women, you have the League of Women Voters that is created in order to there was a fear that, okay, we got the right to vote, now we have to make sure to show that we're going to use it. Because there was a concern that if women didn't, after getting the right to vote, didn't go out and vote in mass, that those that were against it would be like, aha, see, look, we said, women all blah, blah, blah about the right to vote, and now they're not even voting. So the whole thing is stupid kind of thing. So that there was this immediate effort and organization to try to kind of get out the vote drives, essentially, is really what they were for women. And be like, hey, we finally won the right to vote. Now it's your obligation to actually go vote, to show that this is something we should be doing. And their goal was, it was nonpartisan, and it was to explain lobbying. It was voter education and registration. And it was all about just their whole goal was having women be informed, be registered to vote, and actually vote and understand it. Because of course there had not been a lot of education in the whole voting process prior to this. And while women who took it upon themselves to learn it knew, there were lots of women who now found themselves that either had, were supporters but hadn't, done a lot on the details of the government and voting, and others who hadn't done anything for pushing women's right to vote that now, had that right. And so they felt it was extremely important to make sure that women understood and voted, to basically prove against detractors that this was, women should be taken seriously. Because obviously they weren't going to repeal the 19th Amendment after putting an amendment in. It was unlikely that would happen. And that was less the fear than just that all the progress they'd made, and the power that women could have in voting would be diminished and dismissed if women didn't get out there and vote. But at the same time, women needed to understand and learn about the process to do so effectively. You also had at the same time the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. And this was made up of 14 women's organizations. So this was like why it was joint, right? And congressional. So you had a variety of women's organizations get together to form this group. And the goal was to promote legislation backed by, for women, backed by the organization. And so that's looking at, they had a variety of goals. They were mostly, like I said, with women's issues, but it was supporting childcare, looking at women's labor laws, health and safety regulations in the workplace, and women's legal rights. So there was definitely this what seemed like early evidence with some of these early committees that we'll say belief in women as non-partisan voters. So one of the things that, in part because of these groups that came together that had an emphasis on what were called women's issues, right, was the belief that one, women would only focus on women's issues when they voted, right? And that they also were not corrupted, essentially, by partisan politics, because they had not been in the political game, because they had not been able to vote. And some of this had to do with just this idea of what women were going to be focused on. That and then you had all of these organizations for women voters that were nonpartisan. So it wasn't completely out of, whatever, like pulled out of the air that, oh, women are only going to be nonpartisan and stuff like that. There were, the organizations that popped up. A lot of them were nonpartisan at first because their sole focus was like, we have to get women voting, we have to get them educated, and then there were a lot of immediate emphasis on here are women's rights, and this goes to the cult of domesticity as well, right? That the women had promoted this idea that it was a tactic to use to get people to be okay with the idea of women voting. We have home as the haven and the moral center. That's our responsibility, and we can't do that if we can't make legislation and vote for legislation in that area. And that's connected to the domestic sphere. So it's okay, politics aren't for women, but in this case, these domestic issues are. And so that you had this kind of initial thing. If women all voted the same and were and so it was if you're all voting on women's issues, right? If all voted the same, this would create a massive political control. And what we will see is that there was early legislation that emerged that because women are unified, that early Democrats and Republicans put forth women's issues in order to try to not get voted out of office, essentially. And they'd use that threat, right, to get the right to vote. We'll align together as women, and we will, through our political power of our husbands and our sons, force them to vote the way we want, and you will be out of office if you don't support women's rights. And so there was this kind of we'll say women's platform that politicians ran on, because they believed it was necessary, and others out of fear that they wanted to make sure they weren't that they were elected again, based on, again, on this idea that all women are going to agree. One of the most influential, well, not influential, but one that was the most obvious in showing this this came about because of women having the right to vote, and the view that women were nonpartisan is definitely the Shepherd-Towner Act. And so, I mean, it had the potential for being a really positive act for women. But it was initiated pretty quickly, and at the beginning had both Democratic and Republican support. What it did is it gave matching funds to states that provided, so if they provided health care and other services for mothers. And then there was also a child care component. So where this could have been extremely beneficial is, and it also had stuff with maternity leave. Right, is that this would have been super helpful for women working, because you would have had funds. It would have encouraged states to provide health care for women and children, services for mothers, and child care and maternity leave, all things that help women go to work, and that make it harder for women to work, and especially harder for poor women to work when they have to provide for these things. This, again, was passed with bipartisan support. Yet, at the end of the decade, the program had slowed. So, and decade program support had declined, and Congress cut the bill in 1929. And why this happened was that there was a realization that women were split. Women were divided. There was not some universal women's vote that was going to happen. Because almost from the beginning, even though you had these organizations that emerged to educate women, women did not agree, not surprisingly, on the way that they should vote. Even on the Shepherd-Towner Act, there were women who did not support the Shepherd-Towner Act. I'm going to put up from your reading an example. So let me get that up real fast, and then we'll take a look at that. This was a little bit on the crazy side, because there were more logical arguments against it, especially the ERA, which we'll look at in just a second. But it still showcases that there were women who disagreed with this. Now, again, like I said, it is more on the crazy side. But give me a second. Well, it'll be literally a second for you. But I'm going to pause it while I put up the document. Okay, so this is from the book in the readings, and this is Women Patriots Protest the Shepherd-Towner Act, 1926, which, right, you look at the date, 1921 was enacted. By 1926, there was a decline. By 1929, they had cut it altogether. Now, again, this is the more extreme views of it. And then we'll look at some of the more rational arguments, along with the disagreement with the ERA, we'll look at that too. Okay, so the Congress and public tricked. These bills are dishonestly presented to hide their true scope and purpose. They are counterfeit legislation, organized schemes to trick the Congress and the country by pretend humanitarian beneficent appearing bills, masked as welfare and women's measures, and entrusted to certain women's organizations to engineer, the better to allay public suspicion. So, but nonetheless are straight imported communism. This is anti-communist socialist stuff. The Bolshevik wolf rarely gets to the doors of Congress except as Little Red Riding Hood. So they're claiming here that the Shepherd-Towner Act was communist and only was able to pass because of women. Right, they had to use their argument was that they had to use women's causes for it to be tricked into that. Unconstitutional and unpopular. The bill concerns matters over which the American people never gave their federal government an iota of authority. So they do claim it's federal overreaching. And in this specifically, they talk about so it involves the same principles of nationalized, standardized care of children and federal interference between parent and child. And they claim that basically the federal government didn't have the right to that somehow that having child care that was supported by the federal government was stepping into families' life and coming into personal life, and that they shouldn't do that. This is one of the reasons why not the specific not the communist argument, but this idea of this negative. There definitely in the U.S. is a negative view of childcare, and this continues into World War II. So in other countries, when women are going and working in the war industry, the federal government provided free federal and state-sponsored childcare for women specifically women who worked in the war industry, because their husbands were often fighting in the war, and they wanted to help out their country. And so, but then you have children. So what do you do if they're not in school? Provide childcare for those women so they could help the war effort. And not only that, but women would then get to pick up a hot meal that they could bring home to the family at the end of the day. But in the U.S., this was rejected because there was this view that this child care, what it meant was you were not a good mother. Now here, right, they're arguing more than that and saying it's the federal government stepping in to tell you how to raise your kids. But it also was very much connected to that view that women were supposed to raise their children, and if they were having childcare do it, then they were a poor mother. And while other countries didn't have that hang up, the U.S. does. And it definitely, that view impacts women in the 1950s. And we're going to look at the arguments next week of really this dichotomy between women should go work in the war industry, but you were a bad mother for doing so. And they were getting hit from both sides. Be patriotic, be altruistic, help out your country. And you're a crappy mother. And you're like, wait, what? So I either am a bad patriot if I don't help out my country in the war industry during this time, or I'm a bad mother if I do. It's a lose-lose situation, and you're being pulled from both sides. This is where you see some of that and hints of that. Again, this specific document does go to the extreme, but why I put it in here was to highlight that women had different points of views, and they did not agree on what women's issues should be. And here was an example of, it wasn't just one crazy woman writing this, it was a group of women, and a significant group of women, who, for whatever reason, saw this as a communist Bolshevik conspiracy to get this bill in place using women's issues, because they didn't like, especially this. This was a huge part of it. They felt like it was federal interference. Right, more oppressive invasions of the private lives of citizens have recently been proposed or attempted by the encroaching federal power than George III would have dared to impose upon American colonists, citizens, right? So they're saying, right, that this has all created more federal invasion than even George III would have dared to do during the Revolutionary War, or right before the Revolutionary War. Revolutionary conspiracy. The federal maternity bill intrinsically interlocks with the Child Labor Amendment and the Federal Children's Bureau. They constitute with the Federal Education Department bill a unified agency and program of revolution by legislation. They are as deliberate a conspiracy to destroy this republic as any plot has ever hatched to overthrow government by force and violence. So they claimed with this, there was definitely a claim that there was conspiracy of multiple bills for women and children, and the idea that they were all being used to sneak past by communists. And it kind of goes on to that. But Florence Kelley was a huge a proponent of women's rights, and so they're targeting her out. They also talk about the maternity, maternity or childbirth doles for women, maternity benefits, not as a help for needy mothers, but as a natural right, confirmed the socialist doctrine that maternity is a service to the state. Right, so here they're arguing that maternity benefits were like this. So, anyways, enough with the whole point on that. The main point, and certainly the federal government interference is a big one, but the main point is that women did not agree on women's issues, even though that was clearly what looked like was being set up from that. And unfortunately what it did do is, as soon as Democratic and Republican congressmen especially learned this and realized that is that when this was realized, a lot of potentially beneficial beneficial programs for women and children were either stopped before they were created or ended. So for women and children were ended, right? And that could have been, very helpful for women, especially women within the labor force. And then let's go on C here real quick, the ERA. So this was another one that was very controversial, which was the Equal Rights Amendment. This was largely pushed by Alice Paul and the party that she ran, which was the National Women's Party. And this was the belief that the laws should, men and women should have equal rights and be subject to equal jurisdiction. Right, so essentially what this meant was that besides, it would be equal rights and equal laws. So it'd be, equal pay, equal labor laws, right? Equal rights in all aspects. Now, why this was contentious, right? So let's put here, opposition, is that some women, notwithstanding the Bolshevik communist conspiracy stuff, is that what was argued that equal rights could end up hurting women. Right, and they gave a couple examples with this. One was maternity leave, right? In the name, maternity leave, right? This was for women. And instead of envisioning parental leave, right? So parental leave would be equal. Under the Equal Rights Amendment, if you gave maternity leave, you had to give paternity leave. But and not without argument that at this point in time in society, what is the likelihood that they were going to give paternity leave versus the ERA would mean no maternity leave, right? That they argued that if they had the ERA, that instead of creating parental leave so that it meant both men and women, it would only be, they would just say, fine, no maternity leave whatsoever. Because of course, like the US doesn't have, we're like one of the only like industrialized, first world societies that doesn't have required maternity leave, right? Individual companies provide it sometimes, but there's no federal policy in place of requiring maternity leave on a level where you look at any other like country really. And like the amount of maternity, like we have like, we have a small amount, it's like 1 week or 2 weeks, something like that. But even then it's only required, there's all these stipulations. Part-time people don't get maternity leave. There's all these restrictions and stuff. So it's super limited and there's not a unified policy that provides any kind of real level outside of like giving birth. And guaranteed, the only thing is they can't you can't lose your job because of that. But again, there's loopholes for all of this. And anyway, you look at any other country and they have far more months and months of maternity leave, where it's paid, guaranteed job when you get back, time to bond with your infant for like 6 months. In some places it's a whole year. And that, look at arguments that when this stuff was being discussed, and how many people opposed it. You ended up kind of getting this negative mentality around it. Now, the argument that, like I said, for the ERA was that the problem would be is not that they were against maternity leave, but the ERA would actually force out maternity leave altogether, and companies would simply just not provide it. And that was a reasonable concern. But instead of like focusing and saying, so we need to make sure there's paternal leave, that they can't just cut women's because that was the idea, right? That they would cut women and children labor laws, right? That essentially, in order to make it equal, instead of just making it equal for everyone, it would hurt women because all of these protections and policies that were in place would get removed. They weren't so much protesting against equal pay. Most people wanted equal pay. But all these other things they said were problematic. And of course, that's notwithstanding the men that were protesting this and companies, because it would cost them more money. But specifically why women protested this. And then you also have that there were a law that prevented forced overtime for women. So these were often seen as women's protective laws. And right, if the ERA would not allow this. And so there were many women who said, well, no, we like these. I'm working, and again, part of this was, okay, you had women who had children and needed, to be home after work. And so, or also, it created a set hours for women that helped with children. And so many said, if they cut that, I'm not going to be able to work if my job decided to consistently require me to work overtime or work. It was not only overtime, it was late night hours. Right, and so they said that's ultimately going to hurt us if we lose that protection. So again, the point is, right, that even once you had all of the right to vote, and there was all these positives that came out of it, besides just that, that there were still issues and negatives of that. And then, of course, that you ultimately had, right, that with the 19th Amendment, that Black women in the South still largely could not vote. And then with that, right, you had several women's voter groups stop supporting them, essentially saying, well, we got the right to vote, so whatever. So they had to form their own groups to keep fighting for the right to vote. And then just the fundamental difference between, of course, what's the viewpoint then of like your priorities in the South versus the North. So we could put that too, right? Priorities of issues in South versus North, but it could even be more regional too. But the point being is, right, that while you had the League of Women Voters and the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, which were very positive in attempting to show bipartisan support to get women out to vote, that ultimately after a first year or so voting, it became very clear that there were major splits and that women weren't some unified voter. Of course, that was never realistic, but it definitely was the view that got pushed during World War I, the Progressive Era before that, to get women the right to vote. And then in the early days of the 19th Amendment seemed to continue to suggest that, which gave women a lot of political clout initially. But that it also showcases how quick Congress was to then remove and cut these bills that were for women when they realized that the women's vote wasn't going to make or break them, because not all women were voting the same. So they didn't have to put out bills that were supportive of women, because it wasn't quite this unified 50% vote that was going to guarantee either their loss or win. And definitely showcases how much they were pandering to that and didn't really care about some of those issues in the first place. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at is just kind of right, a lot of we're around 5. A lot of the 1920s is about progress. The right to vote, conservative movement, the right to vote, the flappers, the view of women, just the economic progress, right? The 1920s really for women was a very progressive era in many ways. At the same time, you also had a conservative movement that it takes place and kind of is a reaction to these changes as they're happening. The most obvious, was prohibition, which came before the 19th Amendment. The prohibition was the 18th Amendment, but it definitely passed because the coming view of women's right to vote. We'll just say the coming of women's right to vote. And this was largely pushed by women. It didn't mean that there weren't men that supported it. There were. But the main driving force were women, specifically the women's Christian temperance movement. And this was definitely, we talked about the drunkard's progress. This was very much connected to the cult of domesticity. And that connection to the home as a haven. Oops. And moral center. And the feeling and obligation that drinking was destroying the household. These things, right? And so that's where you get the drunkard's progress. And actually, I'll put it up here because I showed it in the Zoom meeting. Oops, let me just rewrite that here. But not everyone obviously can attend that. So let me put it up so you can see that real quick, because it is interesting, the imagery. Okay, so I couldn't find one big enough real quick on the fly when we were doing the Zoom meeting to read. So I made sure so you could read them this time so you can see. So here's the drunkard's progress. And this showcases, this was used to promote prohibition and was definitely connected to the cult of domesticity. So it shows here the woman and child, with her hand it's hard to see, but her hand on her head, looking down, holding her child's hand. And this is the idea of the destruction of the home and family. Oops, trying to combine words. Of the home and family. Okay, and then you have this progression. So step 1, a glass with friends. Step 2, a glass to keep the cold out. Step 3, a glass too much, right? So here, too much is looking a little worse for wear. Step 4, drunk and riotous. So then they're fighting, right? So it goes from a drink with friends to keep the cold out to fighting. Step 5, the summit attained. Jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard. So now, right, a drunkard. Then step 6, poverty and disease. Step 7, forsaken by friends. So now you're alone. This is poverty and disease. And then desperation and crime. And then the last one, suicide. And the inevitable idea, right, so this is, drink with friends. To keep the cold out, whatever that was, fighting. Too much here. One too many. But the idea and the belief was that for the Prohibition movement was that one drink inevitably led to death by suicide. And not that just one drink meant you killed yourself, but one drink inevitably always led to too many, which inevitably led to these steps. And then what the end result was a destruction of the home and family. And so stuff like this that was connected to the cult of domesticity or pushed by women was largely used and effective in, ending this idea that it was destroying the family, and then ultimately was effective in having prohibition come about. And then ultimately repealed with the Great Depression because they wanted the tax money on beer. And it ultimately didn't work. It was a huge part of American life. People began more drinking after. People actually drank more. Here, I'll put this. And women, now, in part, that's with the flappers and stuff too. Women drank more during Prohibition than before. So in many cases, the whole concept, and men as well, that Prohibition would end the drunkard's progress and the destruction, because there were people who became drunks, and it did destroy families, right? It's not to negate alcoholism and the problem, because there was a problem with it, but to suggest that then that means no one can drink, and having, completely outline it all together, especially when it was such a huge part of American life, it wasn't going to be successful. Besides the fact that they didn't have enough law enforcement to do so, and you end up with speakeasies, which was a huge haunt for women. It became the place to go where women attended the speakeasies to have the illegal drinks, and became part of flapper culture as well. And then you have also really the reemergence of, let's see, what are we on here with? You also have a push. There's two other things, last two things we're going to look at. One is going to be a pushback on, we'll say censorship. That there was a push by women, especially, to have censorship, the censorship board for film. This also later expanded to books and education. But where it started was definitely within the film industry. And some of this you could argue is warranted in terms of if we go over to the film industry, there were no because it was such a new thing, there was no regulations on content in film. And so, not surprising, some of the film from the 1920s was more more risque, if you will. It had there were no regulations, so that you definitely had like just general films that were family friendly, and then you had films that were wouldn't be even rated R today because of sexual aspects of it, especially. And so many argued that, so I don't know what would be the best way to say that ultimately there was more sex and language than today in some films. And women argued this was negative for, women and children. They especially targeted children and specifically, right, families. And that there needed to be regulation, that this was morally corrupt and reprehensible, the content, but also the more reasonable argument that, like, if we don't know, like, there's this film and you take the family to, and then it's completely inappropriate for the family, and so it ends up creating the ratings. It creates the ratings board for film. And also then sets up the rating system. And then with that, it outlaws or makes illegal to show certain films in theaters. What happens with this is then, though, with that success, they do expand to try other censorship. And this definitely was connected to with the women's Christian temperance movement as well. And then you have the Ku Klux Klan that reemerges. Right, originally this was part of Reconstruction when it started up, but then had died out in part because the segregated South you didn't have to cover up, you didn't have to hide it. Lynching and violence was allowed out in the open, and so the racist component had never gone away. But there was a reemergence in the 1920s of anti-immigration, where it expanded to target more than just the black population, but anyone that was deemed right. So now that their targets expanded, it's still, of course, very much targeted black people, but expanded to anyone that was deemed non-American. their whole thing was this kind of idea of 100% Americanism. This was one of their slogans. And this certainly was influenced by the anti-immigrant sentiment in World War I and the Americanization of World War I. And it was very much this idea of arguing on conservative, conservative family values. And this definitely was also a reaction to changes in women's roles. Reaction to right that they argued for they were for censorship boards, but it was against women's independence. Against birth control, and against the whole flapper movement in general, right? And so it was definitely it was this idea that race, of course, was still a whole part of it, but this now was what was added into it on top of course, the original right, I guess original, or the reason, we'll just say, I guess. So I'm trying to think of what to say with this specifically, but the idea of that the main, here we go, focus was still to support terrorizing Black people and trying to maintain white supremacy. There we go. Too much to start. I was trying to put it in like a couple words, and it didn't work. Yeah, the main focus was still that. But they expanded to all of these other things, which were very much a direct reaction to these changes, and had many that were targeting the changes to women, as well as the increase in immigration and that Americanization thing that had come out of World War I. There was a new shift in target towards this argument that the current world was destroying women's values and the proper role of women as housewives, and that was in direct relation to what was happening currently in society at the time. They get up to a height of like 2 million members, and so the 1920s, it was actually at its largest ever, compared to, of course, what the numbers were in Reconstruction, which isn't surprising just on population, but it was at its height in membership with 2 million. What's really interesting is actually how it actually deteriorated again, and so, but through a lot of the 1920s, the Klan was a visible force. And part of this was that you did have, push improvements in the North, not in the South, for Black women especially. There was an increase in job opportunities. They were still very limited, but there were women who were pushing back against that domestic help, domestic help. Were looking to carve out their own roles. You have, jazz and the development of Harlem emerging at this time, where you have kind of an early Black Renaissance movement. And that also probably reinforced and encouraged this pushback as well. What's interesting with this is how it ultimately began to decline, because it did seem to gain quite a bit of traction by white men and women who didn't like the direction that the country was going. And what happened is that, so there was a popular radio show, because before television, right, you have movies, but you don't have television yet. And so people at home listened to the radio, and they listened to these radio stories. You had Sherlock Holmes. You can actually still get these online. They're really interesting to listen to. They had murder mysteries. They had action hero ones, superheroes. So the one we're going to look at is the Superman. But they had Sherlock Holmes. They had other mystery stories, and The Tick was one, but Superman was also one. Like I said, if you Google like old radio shows, you can usually find them for free online, and they're definitely worth a listen to. So people would the families would sit around their radio in the evening when these radio shows would come on, and they'd listen to them, kind of like what family eventually sat around the TV and watched their favorite TV shows. This was your entertainment, and so you listened to these stories, and they were weekly serials of stories. One was Superman. So this guy, he actually infiltrated the Klan, and learned their secrets, because the Klan was one of the things that made it intimidating and scary, even as actual violence declined. Now, that doesn't negate there was still violence towards Black people by the Klan. But compared to what it was with just the segregated South or Reconstruction, in the 1920s, through the 1920s, the actual violence had decreased some. But scare tactics had not. Burning crosses on lawns, threatening people, beating up people. Because, this is happening in the North. Lynching wasn't happening in the North. It was still happening in the South, but it wasn't happening in the North. The Klan was functioning in the North, because there they still had a cover up, and while the Klan had some popularity in the South as an organization to reassert that control, they also didn't have to hide still. So where it became kind of new in its large membership was the Northern support. And so you don't have quite the level of violence that you do in the South, in part because there were laws that prevented that, and part of it was sentiment around that as well. Nonetheless, there was significant scare tactics. Their power came in secrecy and fear. And so that was like putting burning crosses in front of people's houses as warnings, beating people up, leaving threatening messages. Doing the marches, public marches, as a show of force, just to scare people, and try to keep them in line. But it was more, it was more than just scaring Black people, because it was to scare immigrants. It was to scare women they saw as inappropriate. Right? They had branched out to a whole lot more hate, essentially. It's like, well, hating one group of people isn't enough. Let's hate almost everyone. And so this guy infiltrated them and became a member, as much as they knew, so that he could learn. They had secret handshakes. They had names, and we know there's like High Wizard and the name Dragon, whatever. There's the names of Imperial Dragon Lord or something like that. They're pretty silly names for these high positions. But they also had like secret handshakes and phrases, so that if you wanted to make sure someone was a Klan member, they only learned them. They only told them to you if you were a member. So he became a member to learn these, and then shared them with the people who made the Superman radio show. And then what they did is they outed all of these secret handshakes, slogans, titles, and outed it by having Superman not only stop the Klan members, but make fun of all of these secrets. So all the secretive components of the Klan that had been kind of fear-inducing became a joke. And this helped weaken their seriousness, and people began to look at them not as serious, but as a joke. And then on top of that, Hiram Evans, who was he was the Imperial Wizard, he ended up getting into legal trouble and arrested. So that didn't help either. But I think the more interesting thing was this systematic attempt by using modern technology with mass culture, which wasn't just film, but radio at the time, to publicly not only shame and mock the Klan, but systematically begin to demystify it and weaken its power over people. And that helped in the later period of time in the late 20s, early 30s, decline some of its power that it had gained in the early 20s. Okay, that's where we're stopping today. We're going to look at the Great Depression and New Deals together, and how the Great Depression impacted women and families, and then kind of why the New Deals often didn't include women, and the small areas that they did.